A new beginning with old shadows. Richard sat in his corner office, the panoramic view of the bustling city reflected in the glass behind him. He was, by all accounts, a man who had it all: wealth, power, and a reputation that made even his competitors tread carefully. At 55, Richard had built a multi-million-dollar empire in tech, cementing himself as one of the top CEOs in the country. He could buy anything he wanted, go anywhere, and dine with whoever he pleased. But there was one thing he had never been able to buy: peace. Deep down, he knew that the skeletons in his closet were real, and one day they would emerge to haunt him. His assistant knocked on the door. "Mr. Parker, you have a 2 p.m. with the investors." "Yes, thank you, Linda," Richard replied, his voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil brewing inside him. He had become a master of masks, able to compartmentalize his emotions and focus on the tasks that brought him the most success. For a long time, that strategy had worked, until now. As Linda left, Richard felt a wave of unease. He stared at his reflection in the office window and noticed the first hints of aging, the gray creeping into his once jet-black hair, and the lines around his eyes that seemed to deepen with each passing year. He was still handsome, but those eyes, those sharp, calculating eyes, betrayed a secret. It had been over 2 decades since he had last seen Vanessa. Vanessa. The name sent a chill down his spine. It had been more than a fleeting affair, at least for her. She had been his assistant, beautiful and sharp, someone who had caught his attention not just for her looks, but for her ambition. She had wanted more from life, just as he had in his younger years. They had shared late nights in the office, conversations over coffee that turned into dinners, and then into something far more intimate. But Richard never let himself get too close. His heart had always been with something else: his business, his empire. When Vanessa told him she was pregnant, his first thought wasn't about starting a family with her. It was about protecting everything he had built. His family, the one he was born into, would never accept her, a young black woman from a modest background. His wife, Julia, and her influential family were his lifeline to the upper echelons of society. So Richard did what he always did when faced with a problem. He eliminated it. He had fired Vanessa, coldly and without explanation, and made sure she understood that contacting him again would lead to consequences. He hadn't just abandoned her. He had erased her from his life, as though she had never existed. For the next 24 years, he pushed the memory of her and the child she claimed to carry deep into the recesses of his mind, convincing himself that it was a necessary sacrifice for the greater good of his empire. But now, decades later, something felt off. As he glanced through his emails, a notification popped up, drawing his attention. It was from an anonymous sender, and the subject line read simply, "Your past is about to catch up with you." Richard's heart raced as he clicked it open. The message was short and precise. 24 years ago, you left behind a woman and a child. The child is now a man, and he will come for you. You can't escape your blood. For the first time in years, Richard felt fear, real, visceral fear. He immediately closed his laptop and stood, his hands trembling slightly. Who could this be? Vanessa? Impossible. He had made sure she was gone, far away from his world. Or maybe it was the child, the son she claimed he fathered. But how could this be? He quickly shook off the thought and tried to focus on the upcoming meeting. He couldn't afford to let this nonsense distract him. He told himself it was probably a scam, someone fishing for money or trying to rattle them. After all, he had dealt with threats before. This was just another bump in the road, nothing more. But as the day wore on, the nagging feeling persisted. He thought back to those final moments with Vanessa, the way her eyes had filled with tears, the way she had begged him to stay, to be a part of the child's life. He had been so cold back then, so certain that he was doing what was best for his future. But now, sitting at the pinnacle of success, he couldn't help but wonder what had become of her. And what about the child? If he was still out there, what kind of man had he become? As Richard prepared to leave for the day, he couldn't shake the growing sense of dread that this was far from over. He had buried Vanessa and her child in the past, but now it seemed the past had a way of digging itself back up. He couldn't help but feel that the luxurious life he had built for himself was about to unravel, piece by piece. As the elevator doors closed behind him, the eerie silence of the building echoed in his ears. He had always prided himself on being one step ahead of everyone, on controlling his destiny. But what if, for the first time in his life, he was no longer in control? The next morning, Richard arrived at his office early, but something felt different. His assistant, Linda, was nowhere to be seen, and the office felt unsettlingly quiet. As he stepped into his office, there was a man already sitting in the leather chair in front of his desk. "Who the hell are you?" Richard barked, his pulse quickening. How had someone gotten in here without his knowledge? The man slowly turned in the chair, meeting Richard's gaze with calm, dark eyes. His expression was unreadable, but there was a quiet intensity about him that made Richard uneasy. "My name is Jaden," the man said, his voice steady, almost too steady. "I think you know who I am." Richard's blood ran cold. Jaden continued, his voice still calm, but now tinged with a cold edge. "I'm the son you never wanted." In that moment, Richard felt the weight of every decision, every lie, and every selfish act crash down on him. The son he had abandoned, the child he had once dismissed as an inconvenience, was now standing before him, a grown man, demanding answers. For the first time in his life, Richard didn't know what to say. The reckoning begins. Richard stared at Jaden, his mind struggling to comprehend the man standing before him. He was tall, with the same sharp features Richard saw in the mirror every morning. But his skin, darker than Richard's, carried the unmistakable mark of his mother, Vanessa. For a moment, the room was silent, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning. Richard's heart pounded in his chest, the weight of his past catching up with him in ways he had never imagined. This was the son he had never acknowledged, the boy he had abandoned before he was even born, and now he had become a man. An angry, determined man who clearly wasn't here to reconcile. "Your son," Richard finally managed to say, his voice shaking slightly. He immediately regretted how weak he sounded. "Yes," Jaden replied, standing up from the chair and stepping closer to Richard's desk. "Your son, the one you left behind, the one you never cared to know." Richard took a step back, instinctively moving toward the safety of his desk, where he had always felt in control. But in that moment, he felt anything but. He had faced ruthless business rivals, billion-dollar lawsuits, and the most stressful mergers, but nothing had prepared him for this. Nothing had prepared him for facing the consequences of the decisions he had made 24 years ago. I didn't know," Richard stammered, searching for something, anything, that could lessen the blow of Jaden's presence. Jaden's expression hardened. "You didn't know. That's a lie, and you know it. My mother told you. She told you she was pregnant, and you fired her. You fired her and left her to fend for herself. And now, here we are." Richard felt a chill crawl up his spine. How could this be happening? He had buried the memory of Vanessa so deep within himself that it felt like another lifetime. He had convinced himself that cutting ties with her had been the right thing to do, for his career, for his marriage, for his future. But now, standing face to face with his son, the son he had never wanted to meet, he realized that he had been running from a shadow that had grown larger with every passing year. I had no choice," Richard said, his voice barely a whisper. He knew the words sounded pathetic, but he couldn't think of anything else to say. "You have to understand, Jaden. My life, my career, it was all at stake. Your mother." "Don't you dare," Jaden cut him off, his voice low but dangerous. "Don't you dare try to blame this on her. My mother did nothing wrong. You made the decision to abandon us, and you made it alone." Richard felt his knees grow weak as Jaden's words slammed into him like punches. He collapsed into his chair, unable to face the accusatory stare of the young man standing before him. He tried to summon the strength that had carried him through his years of corporate conquest, but it wasn't there. Not this time. "Why are you here?" Richard asked, finally meeting Jaden's gaze. "What do you want from me?" Jaden leaned over the desk, his hands gripping the edge as he glared down at Richard. "I want answers. I want to know why you thought you could just walk away from your responsibility like it was nothing. I want to know why my mother had to suffer for all these years, struggling to raise me on her own, while you lived a life of luxury. I want to know how you can sleep at night, knowing that you destroyed her life." Richard swallowed hard. He had spent years perfecting the art of deception, of convincing himself that he had made the right choices. But now, faced with the raw truth in Jaden's eyes, all of those lies fell apart. He could feel the walls of his carefully constructed life beginning to crumble around him. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if he could rebuild them. I can't change the past," Richard said weakly. "I can't undo what I did. But I can try to make things right now. I can. Make things right." Jaden laughed bitterly. "You think you can just throw money at this, and it'll go away? Is that what you do with all your problems? You think you can buy your way out of this?" Richard's hands trembled as he reached for his checkbook, the familiar solution to so many of his troubles. "I'm willing to help. Financially. I can support you and your mother. I'll pay for whatever you need. Jaden slammed his hand down on the desk, cutting Richard off mid-sentence. "I don't want your money," he spat, his voice filled with fury. "My mother doesn't want your money. She didn't raise me to beg for scraps from a man like you." Richard recoiled at Jaden's words, the sting of truth sharp and unyielding. For so long, money had been his solution to every problem. In the world of business, it was the universal currency of power, of control. But here, in this room, it was worthless. "What do you want, then?" Richard asked, his voice shaking. "What do you want from me?" Jaden straightened, his eyes never leaving Richard's. "I want you to acknowledge what you did. I want you to admit that you abandoned us, that you left my mother to struggle while you went on with your life like we never existed. I want you to say it. Right here, right now." Richard felt a lump form in his throat. He had never been a man who apologized. To apologize was to admit weakness, and weakness had no place in the world he had built for himself. But now, looking into Jaden's eyes, he realized that he had no choice. If he wanted any hope of salvaging what was left of his humanity, he would have to do the one thing he had always avoided. "I'm sorry," Richard whispered, his voice trembling. "I'm sorry for what I did to you and your mother. I was wrong." Jaden's expression didn't change. He stood there, unmoved by Richard's apology. "Words are cheap," he said coldly. "You've had 24 years to say that, and now it means nothing." Richard felt a wave of despair wash over him. He had always believed that he could control any situation, that he could manipulate people into giving him what he wanted. But here, in this moment, he realized that he had lost all control. There was nothing he could say or do that would make things right. Not with Jaden. Not with Vanessa. For a long moment, the two men stood in silence, the tension between them thick and suffocating. Richard's mind raced, trying to think of a way to diffuse the situation, but every option felt hollow, meaningless. He had no more cards to play. Finally, Jaden spoke again, his voice softer this time, but no less intense. "I didn't come here for an apology," he said. "I came here to tell you that you're going to be a part of this. Whether you like it or not, you're going to help my mother. You're going to be there for her, because that's what you should have done 24 years ago." Richard looked up at Jaden, surprised by the shift in his tone. "What do you mean?" Jaden stepped back, crossing his arms as he studied Richard carefully. "My mother has cancer," he said quietly. "She's been fighting it for months, but the treatment is expensive, more expensive than we can afford. And now you're going to pay for it." Richard's heart sank. Cancer. The word echoed in his mind, a heavy weight that pressed down on him. Vanessa had always been so strong, so full of life. The thought of her being sick, of her fighting for her life, was almost too much to bear. I didn't know," Richard said, his voice barely a whisper. "Of course you didn't," Jaden replied coldly. "You never cared enough to find out. But now you're going to make it right. You're going to pay for her treatment, and you're going to do it without question. Because if you don't, I'll make sure the world knows exactly who you are and what you did." Richard felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He had built his entire life on the foundation of his reputation, on the respect and admiration of his peers. If Jaden exposed him, if the truth came out, everything he had worked for would be destroyed. "All right," Richard said, his voice shaking. "I'll pay for her treatment. I'll do whatever it takes." Jaden nodded, satisfied with Richard's response. "Good. You'll get the details from me soon. And don't think for a second that this erases the past. This is just the beginning." With that, Jaden turned and walked toward the door, leaving Richard sitting behind his desk, staring at the space where his son had stood. The weight of the encounter hung heavy in the air, suffocating him. He had thought that he could outrun his past, but now it had caught up with him, and there was no escape. As the door closed behind Jaden, Richard leaned back in his chair, his mind reeling. The empire he had built felt fragile now, as if it could crumble at any moment. He had always believed that success was measured in wealth, in power, in control. But now, for the first time, he realized that there were things he couldn't buy, things that no amount of money could fix. And as the sun began to set behind the city skyline, Richard understood that his reckoning had only just begun, unraveling the threads of deception. Richard's hands trembled as he poured himself a glass of whiskey. The bottle clinked against the crystal tumbler, the sound unnervingly loud in his otherwise silent office. He swallowed hard, hoping the burn of the liquor would steady him, but nothing seemed capable of calming the storm raging inside. His conversation with Jaden had left him rattled in a way no business deal or corporate betrayal ever had. This wasn't something he could fix with a few phone calls, a well-placed bribe, or a powerful ally. This was his past, messy, raw, and full of consequences he had thought he buried for good. But like some twisted ghost, it had returned, embodied in the form of the son he had never wanted, a son who now held the key to his future. Vanessa. His thoughts kept drifting back to her, to those long, quiet nights in the office, when the lines between professional and personal had blurred beyond recognition. He had been drawn to her not just because she was beautiful, but because she was strong, confident in a way that few women around him had been. But when the pregnancy happened, all of that had vanished in his mind, replaced by a cold, ruthless calculation of how best to protect his life, his career, his marriage. And now she had cancer. Richard's chest tightened with guilt. The thought of Vanessa suffering, fighting for her life, while he lived comfortably in his penthouse suite, surrounded by wealth and power, gnawed at him. He had convinced himself, over the years, that leaving her had been a necessary sacrifice. But in the end, had it really been worth it? The door to his office creaked open, and Linda, his assistant, stepped inside, her usually bright and efficient demeanor shadowed by concern. "Mr. Parker," she said softly, "your wife is on the line. She's been calling for the past hour." Richard snapped out of his reverie and took a deep breath, forcing himself to maintain control. His wife, Julia, had been growing increasingly suspicious in the past few months. His frequent absences, the late nights at the office that weren't always about work, and the subtle shift in his demeanor had not gone unnoticed. "I'll call her back later," he said, trying to sound nonchalant. Linda hesitated, her eyes searching his face. "Are you all right, sir? You seem off today." Richard waved her off, not in the mood for her concern. "I'm fine, Linda. Just a lot on my mind. You can go." She gave him one last glance before nodding and slipping out of the office. The door closed softly behind her, leaving Richard alone once more with his thoughts. He stared at his phone, contemplating whether to return Julia's call. She had always been his pillar of stability, the woman who came from a family of influence, whose marriage to him had elevated his status in ways he couldn't have achieved on his own. He had built his empire, but it was Julia's connections, her name, that had opened doors to the circles he now moved in effortlessly. And now, if Jaden decided to expose him, he risked losing not just his wife, but everything that came with her. Richard slammed the glass of whiskey down on the desk, the amber liquid sloshing over the rim. He needed a plan. He needed control. As he reached for his phone, an idea began to form in his mind. Dangerous, perhaps, but necessary. He dialed a number he hadn't used in years. After a few rings, a gruff voice answered. "Mr. Parker," the man said, his tone professional but cautious. "Yes, it's me." "I need a favor," Richard replied, his voice low and steady. "I need some information about someone." Discreetly. Meanwhile, across the city, Jaden sat beside his mother's hospital bed, his emotions tangled in a knot of anger, sadness, and uncertainty. Vanessa was sleeping, her face pale and gaunt, her once vibrant energy dimmed by months of battling the cancer that had ravaged her body. He watched her chest rise and fall slowly, the sound of the heart monitor beeping rhythmically in the background. He had done it. He had confronted the man responsible for so much of their pain, and now Richard was paying for Vanessa's treatment. But instead of feeling victorious, Jaden felt hollow. The money was necessary. He knew that, but it didn't erase the years of hardship his mother had endured. It didn't erase the nights she had worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table, or the time she had been forced to smile through her tears when Jaden asked about his father. Jaden leaned back in the uncomfortable hospital chair, rubbing his eyes. He had thought confronting Richard would give him closure, but it had only opened new wounds. His father's apology had felt insincere, like it was made out of fear rather than genuine remorse. And now, Jaden was left wondering if dragging Richard into their lives had been a mistake. He had wanted justice, but at what cost? A soft groan from the bed pulled Jaden from his thoughts. Vanessa was waking up, her eyelids fluttering as she slowly came to consciousness. "Jaden," she whispered, her voice raspy and weak. "I'm here, Mom," he said softly, reaching for her hand. Vanessa smiled weakly, her fingers curling around his. "You should go home and get some rest. You've been here for days." Jaden shook his head. "I'm not going anywhere, Mom. I'm staying right here with you." She sighed, her eyes filling with emotion. "You've always been such a good son, Jaden. I'm so proud of you." He smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You're the one who should be proud, Mom. You raised me all on your own. You didn't need him." Vanessa's expression faltered, and she turned her head away slightly. "Jaden, about your father." Jaden stiffened. He had avoided telling her about the confrontation with Richard. He didn't want to burden her with the details, especially not while she was fighting for her life. But now, with her eyes searching his, he knew he couldn't hide it any longer. "I went to see him," Jaden said quietly. Vanessa's eyes widened, a flicker of fear crossing her face. "You? You confronted him?" Jaden nodded, his jaw tightening. "I had to, Mom. I couldn't just sit back and let him go on living his life like we never existed. He's paying for your treatment now. He has to." Vanessa closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Jaden, I never wanted you to get involved with him. I never wanted you to go after him like this. It's not worth it." Jaden frowned, confused by her reaction. "Not worth it? Mom, he abandoned us. He left you to struggle on your own. How is that not worth fighting for?" Vanessa opened her eyes again, her gaze filled with a sadness Jaden had never seen before. "Because holding on to that anger will only hurt you, Jaden. It will consume you, just like it consumed me for so many years. I've made my peace with the past. I don't need him anymore. I never did." Jaden stared at her, his heart heavy with conflicting emotions. How could she be so forgiving? How could she let go of the pain so easily? For years, he had carried that anger with him, using it to fuel his drive, his ambition. It had become a part of him. And now, hearing his mother tell him to let it go, he wasn't sure if he could. "But Mom," Jaden began, but she cut him off gently. "Listen to me, Jaden. You're a grown man now. You've made a life for yourself. Don't let your father's mistakes define you. Don't let his absence be the thing that drives you. You're better than that." Her words cut through him, leaving him raw and exposed. Jaden felt the weight of his mother's wisdom settle on his shoulders, heavier than the anger he had carried for so long. She was right. He had built a life for himself without Richard. He didn't need his father to validate his existence, but could he really let go of the bitterness that had driven him for so long? Vanessa squeezed his hand weakly, pulling him out of his thoughts. "Promise me something, Jaden. Promise me you won't let him take any more of your life. He's taken enough from us. Don't let him take your peace." Jaden swallowed hard, his throat tightening with emotion. "I promise, Mom," he whispered. Vanessa smiled softly, her eyes closing again as exhaustion overtook her. "That's my boy." Later that evening, Jaden left the hospital, his mind heavy with his mother's words. As he walked down the dimly lit street, he felt a strange sense of emptiness. He had spent so long chasing after justice, after the idea of making Richard pay, that he hadn't stopped to consider what it would cost him. Now, with his mother urging him to let go, he found himself lost in a sea of uncertainty. What did he really want from Richard? Money wasn't the answer. No amount of financial support could undo the years of pain and abandonment. And now, with his mother's health slowly improving, Jaden realized that his real battle wasn't with his father. It was with himself, his anger, his resentment, his need for validation. As he crossed the street, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from an unknown number. "I know what you're planning. Back off before you regret it." Jaden stopped in his tracks, his blood running cold. He glanced around, but the street was empty, save for a few distant figures walking in the opposite direction. His heart raced as he read the message again. Someone was watching him. Someone knew about his confrontation with Richard. Suddenly, the weight of the situation became all too real. He had thought he was in control, that he was the one holding the cards. But now, it seemed that Richard had his own plans, and Jaden was walking straight into them. As he stood there, the phone still clutched in his hand, Jaden realized that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Dark revelations and dangerous consequences. Jaden stood frozen on the sidewalk, the ominous message glaring up at him from his phone's screen. The streetlights cast long, flickering shadows around him. But the creeping sense of dread that settled in his chest was anything but a shadow. It was real. The text had come from an unknown number. And while the message was short, the threat was clear. Who could have sent it? Was it Richard himself? Or maybe someone working for him? The reality hit Jaden hard. Whatever game he thought he was playing, Richard was no ordinary man to cross. His father was a powerful CEO with resources, influence, and connections in every corner of the city. Richard had protected his secrets for over 2 decades, and now, if Jaden wasn't careful, he could become collateral damage in Richard's desperate attempt to keep his carefully constructed life from collapsing. His hands clenched around the phone. Jaden forced himself to breathe deeply. He had confronted Richard, demanded justice, but clearly that hadn't been enough. Richard wasn't going to just pay for his mother's treatment and let things end there. He wanted control. He wanted silence. And now, Jaden knew he had crossed a line. Looking around once more, Jaden shoved the phone back into his pocket and headed toward his car. The street was deserted, the only sound the echo of his footsteps on the pavement. But Jaden couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him, following his every move. He quickened his pace, trying to calm the rising fear in his chest. He needed to think, to regroup, and most of all, he needed to figure out his next move before Richard's world closed in on him. Meanwhile, Richard sat in the dim glow of his penthouse study, his jaw tight as he replayed the events of the day over and over in his mind. Jaden's visit had left him shaken. He had thought he could handle the situation, make a few payments, and be done with it. But the confrontation had rattled him more than he'd anticipated. The look in Jaden's eyes, the cold fury beneath the calm exterior. It was something Richard had seen before in his enemies, not in his own flesh and blood. He stared at the whiskey glass in his hand, his reflection distorted in the amber liquid. 24 years ago, he had made a choice. He had chosen his career, his reputation, and his marriage over responsibility. Vanessa had been a casualty of that decision. Now he was facing the consequences, not only of abandoning her, but of neglecting his own son. A son he barely knew. A son who had inherited his sharp mind and unyielding determination. Richard felt a surge of frustration as he stood and paced the length of the room. He had been on top for so long, controlling everything, everyone. His business, his family, his reputation. He wasn't used to being backed into a corner, and yet that's exactly where Jaden had placed him. He needed a way out, a way to ensure Jaden wouldn't expose him, wouldn't ruin everything he had built, and he needed it fast. His phone buzzed on the desk, the screen lighting up with a message. He reached for it, recognizing the number immediately. It was from the private investigator he had hired earlier. Found some dirt on the kid. We need to talk. Richard felt a flicker of hope. This could be the leverage he needed. If Jaden thought he had the upper hand, it was time to remind him that Richard Parker didn't go down without a fight. The next day, Jaden sat in his small apartment, staring at his laptop screen. His mind was racing with thoughts of the mysterious text message, but his heart remained focused on his mother. She was doing better, thanks to the treatments Richard was paying for, but the hospital bills kept piling up, and Jaden knew they couldn't afford to lose Richard's financial support. Not yet. His mother was still fragile, and her recovery, while promising, was far from guaranteed. He hated that he had to rely on Richard for anything. It made him feel weak, like a pawn in his father's twisted game. But the alternative, letting his mother suffer because of his pride, was not an option. As he scrolled through emails from the hospital and messages from old friends checking in, Jaden's thoughts kept returning to the text. Who had sent it? Why now? He hadn't told anyone about his confrontation with Richard, not even his best friend, Kyle, or his mother. It was too risky. The fewer people involved, the better. Yet, someone knew. Someone was watching. His phone buzzed again, jolting him from his thoughts. It was another text, from the same unknown number. Meet me tonight, 9 p.m., the alley behind 34th and Madison. Don't be late. Jaden's heart skipped a beat. The location was seedy, a forgotten part of the city known for its rundown buildings and shady dealings. It wasn't the kind of place anyone wanted to be after dark. But if this was his only chance to get some answers, he had no choice. He knew it was a risk. Whoever was on the other end of those messages could be dangerous. It could be a trap. But Jaden was tired of being in the dark. He was tired of reacting to Richard's moves without knowing the full scope of the game. If there was a way to get ahead, to figure out what was really going on, he had to take it. At 8:45 p.m., Jaden left his apartment, a deep sense of foreboding settling in his gut as he made his way through the city streets. The further he got from the bustling lights of downtown, the more desolate the neighborhood became. Streetlights flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows along the cracked sidewalks. Graffiti-covered walls loomed on either side of the narrow alley as he approached the meeting point. Jaden scanned the area, his nerves on edge. The alley was dark, lit only by a single dim street lamp at the far end. A few garbage bins lined the walls, and the faint smell of rot lingered in the air. He stood there, waiting, his fists clenched in his pockets. His mind raced through worst-case scenarios, but he couldn't back down now. Not when he was this close to uncovering the truth. Minutes ticked by, and just as he began to question whether he'd been set up, a figure emerged from the shadows. Jaden tensed, his heart pounding in his chest as the man stepped into the light. It was Richard's private investigator. "Jaden," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. "I'm here to deliver a message." Jaden narrowed his eyes, every instinct telling him to keep his guard up. "What kind of message?" The investigator stepped closer, his expression hard, unreadable. "Richard knows what you're doing. He's willing to play nice for now, but don't push him. You might think you have the upper hand, but you don't. He has resources you can't even imagine." Jaden's blood boiled. "Is that supposed to scare me? Because it's not going to work. He's not the only one with something to lose here." The man smirked, his lips curling into a cold smile. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't just about money. Richard's playing a bigger game, and if you keep pushing, you'll end up losing more than just your father's money." Jaden took a step forward, his anger rising. "I don't care about his money. I care about my mother. And if Richard thinks he can intimidate me, he's wrong." The investigator shook his head, his eyes gleaming with something sinister. "Your mother's already been through enough. You really want to put her through more. Walk away, Jaden. Take the money, get your mother the help she needs, and disappear. Otherwise, things will get messy." Jaden clenched his fists, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. He could feel the threat hanging in the air, heavy and undeniable. Whoever this man was, he wasn't bluffing. Richard was prepared to do whatever it took to protect his empire, even if it meant destroying Jaden in the process. "You can tell Richard I'm not going anywhere," Jaden said through gritted teeth. "He doesn't get to decide how this ends." The investigator's smirk widened. "We'll see about that." Without another word, the man turned and disappeared back into the shadows, leaving Jaden standing alone in the cold, empty alley. His mind raced, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and fury. Richard was playing dirty, and now Jaden knew just how dangerous his father really was. He had to be careful. He had to think strategically. But most of all, he had to protect his mother, because Richard's reach was longer than Jaden had imagined. Back at the hospital, Vanessa lay in her bed, her eyes closed, her breathing shallow. She had been doing better, but the treatments were taking their toll. The doctors had been optimistic, but Vanessa knew her body well enough to sense that her time was limited. She was tired, tired of fighting, tired of the pain, tired of the weight that had hung over her since the day Richard walked out of her life. She had never told Jaden everything. She had kept certain parts of the story hidden, not out of shame, but out of fear. Fear that he would see the full extent of the damage Richard had done. Fear that he would go after his father and lose himself in the process. And now, as she lay there, drifting in and out of sleep, Vanessa's mind wandered back to those days, back to the moments before it all fell apart. The memories came flooding back, unbidden and painful. She had loved Richard once, deeply. She had believed in him, in the life they could have had together. But that love had been shattered the moment he turned his back on her, on their child. Vanessa had tried to move on, tried to forget, but the scars had remained. Now, as she faced the possibility of her own death, she wondered if she had made the right choice all those years ago. Should she have fought harder? Should she have exposed Richard sooner? But it was too late for regrets now. All she could do was pray that Jaden wouldn't be consumed by the same darkness that had taken her. As Jaden made his way back home that night, he knew one thing for certain. The battle was far from over. Richard had power, resources, and a willingness to destroy anything that threatened his carefully constructed life. But Jaden had something his father didn't: truth. And in the end, Jaden was willing to bet everything on that. But as the pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place, Jaden couldn't help but wonder just how far Richard was willing to go, and whether Jaden would survive long enough to find out. The price of truth. The days after Jaden's confrontation in the alley felt like walking through quicksand. Every step forward seemed heavier than the last, the weight of his mother's illness and the looming shadow of his father pressing down on him from all sides. He couldn't escape the thought that Richard was orchestrating something darker, something more insidious. Every night, as he lay in bed, his mind raced with possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. But there was no turning back now. Jaden had crossed the line, and if he wanted to protect his mother and unravel the web of lies that had been spun around his life, he would have to see this through to the end, no matter the cost. His phone vibrated on the nightstand, pulling him from the thin veil of sleep he'd managed to fall into. He reached for it groggily, his eyes squinting against the early morning light filtering through the curtains. It was another text from the unknown number. "Last chance. Drop this now, or you'll regret it. We won't ask again." Jaden stared at the message, his jaw tightening. He felt a familiar surge of anger, but now, beneath it, there was also fear. Whoever was sending these texts was serious. They knew things about him, about his mother, about his movements. And the fact that they were still threatening him meant that Richard was preparing something, some kind of final move to silence him for good. He swung his legs over the edge of the bed, his mind already calculating his next steps. He couldn't afford to wait for Richard to make the first move. If he was going to end this, he needed to strike first, and strike hard. Jaden grabbed his laptop and opened the file he had been compiling over the past few weeks. It was a collection of everything he had on Richard: old business dealings, shady financial reports, press clippings, and most importantly, the DNA test results. Jaden had thought about releasing it all, making it public in one explosive reveal, but something held him back. Not fear exactly, though the fear was real, but something deeper. Revenge had driven him this far, but now, as he stared at the cold, hard evidence, he wondered if that was enough. Would exposing Richard really fix anything? Would it save his mother? Or would it just drag them both into the kind of ugly public spectacle that Richard was so good at surviving? Jaden knew one thing for sure. He needed more information before he made his final move. He needed to understand just how deep Richard's secrets went, and there was only one person who could help him with that. Vanessa stirred in her hospital bed, her eyelids fluttering open as the familiar sounds of beeping monitors and the distant hum of hospital activity filled the room. She turned her head and saw Jaden sitting by her side, his brow furrowed in thought, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "Jaden," she whispered, her voice weak but steady. "You've been here all night." Jaden smiled softly, though the exhaustion was clear in his eyes. "Yeah, Mom, I didn't want to leave you." She reached out and took his hand, her fingers cold and fragile. "You don't have to stay here all the time. I'm going to be fine. You need to take care of yourself too." Jaden nodded, though he knew he wouldn't be able to relax until his mother was out of the woods. She had been improving, but the road to recovery was long, and the doctors had been clear. There were no guarantees. Every time he saw her in that hospital bed, he was reminded of the fragility of life, and of how much he stood to lose if he didn't act soon. "I know, Mom," he said quietly, "but I need to talk to you about something." Vanessa's brow furrowed as she studied her son's face. "What is it? You look troubled." Jaden took a deep breath, steeling himself. He had avoided telling her everything about his confrontation with Richard, but now, there was no choice. She needed to know what he was dealing with, and she needed to understand the lengths Richard was willing to go to keep his secrets hidden. "I went to see Richard," Jaden began, his voice low and measured. "I told him about your cancer. I told him he needed to pay for your treatment." Vanessa's eyes widened, and she sat up slightly, her strength returning for a brief moment. "Jaden, why did you do that? I told you I didn't want you to get involved with him." "I had to, Mom," Jaden replied, his voice tight. "I couldn't just sit by and do nothing while you were suffering. Richard abandoned us. He owes us this." Vanessa shook her head, her eyes filled with a sadness Jaden had rarely seen. "I understand why you're angry, Jaden. But Richard, he's dangerous. You don't know him like I do. He won't stop until he gets what he wants. And if you keep pushing him—" "I'm not afraid of him," Jaden interrupted, his jaw clenched with determination. "I'm not going to let him bully us anymore." Vanessa sighed, leaning back against the pillows. "It's not about fear. It's about survival. Richard is a master at manipulation. He'll find a way to twist this, to turn it all back on you. And I don't want you to get hurt because of me." Jaden's heart ached at the thought of his mother being worried about him, even now, in the midst of her own battle. But he couldn't back down, not when he had come this far. "I won't let him hurt us," Jaden promised. "But I need to know everything, Mom. I need to know what really happened between you and Richard." Vanessa hesitated, her eyes searching Jaden's face. For a long moment, she seemed to be weighing something deep inside her, a secret she had carried for too long. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Richard and I. It wasn't just an affair," she began, her gaze distant as she remembered those days long ago. "It was more complicated than that. He promised me things, Jaden. He told me we would build a life together, that he loved me. And I believed him. I was young, and I was in love." Jaden listened in silence, his heart tightening with every word. He had always known there was more to the story, but hearing it now from his mother's lips was like reliving the betrayal all over again. "But when I told him I was pregnant, everything changed," Vanessa continued, her voice trembling. He didn't just leave me. He threatened me, Jaden. He told me that if I ever came after him, if I ever tried to ruin his life, he would destroy me. He had connections, powerful people who could make my life hell. And back then, I was scared. I didn't know what to do. So I let him go." Jaden's hands balled into fists as he listened. The anger that had simmered beneath the surface for so long now erupted into a white-hot fury. He had known Richard was ruthless, but hearing the full extent of his cruelty, of the way he had manipulated and threatened his mother, made Jaden's blood boil. "He did this to you," Jaden whispered, his voice shaking. "He made you live in fear all these years. And now he's trying to do the same to me." Vanessa nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I didn't want you to get involved because I knew he would come after you, Jaden. Richard doesn't care about anyone but himself. He'll do whatever it takes to protect his reputation, his empire." Jaden stood abruptly, pacing the room as his mind raced. He had to stop Richard. He couldn't let this man continue to control their lives. But how? How could he fight someone with so much power, so much influence? Then, an idea struck him. It was dangerous, reckless even, but it might be the only way to bring Richard down once and for all. "Mom," Jaden said, turning to face Vanessa, "I need to know everything. Every detail, every piece of evidence you have from your time with Richard. Anything that can prove what he did to you." Vanessa looked up at him, her expression wary. "Why, Jaden? What are you planning?" "I'm going to expose him," Jaden said, his voice hard with determination. "But not just for the affair. I'm going to show the world what kind of man he really is. The threats, the manipulation, the lies. I'm going to make sure everyone knows the truth." Vanessa's eyes widened with alarm. "Jaden, you can't." "I have to," Jaden interrupted. "It's the only way to stop him. If we don't fight back, he's going to keep hurting people. He's going to keep controlling us. And I can't let that happen." Vanessa's face softened, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and pride. "I don't want you to get hurt, Jaden. But if this is what you need to do, I won't stop you." Jaden knelt beside the bed, taking her hand in his. "I won't let him hurt you anymore, Mom. I promise." Vanessa nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. "Just be careful, Jaden. Please." That night, Jaden began digging deeper into his mother's past, searching for anything that could help him take Richard down. Vanessa had kept some of the letters Richard had written her, promises scrawled on expensive stationery, letters filled with lies about a future they never had. She had also kept notes, diaries detailing the affair, the threats, the emotional abuse she had suffered after she revealed her pregnancy. It wasn't much, but it was enough to paint a picture of a man who had manipulated, controlled, and abandoned the people who trusted him. Jaden spent hours scanning documents, piecing together the timeline of events, building a case that could expose Richard's true nature. But as he worked, a nagging voice in the back of his mind warned him that Richard wouldn't go down without a fight. He had already sent his private investigator to deliver a warning, and Jaden knew that if he pushed too hard, Richard would retaliate. But it didn't matter anymore. Jaden was willing to risk everything, his safety, his future, to stop Richard. Because this wasn't just about revenge. This was about justice. For his mother, for himself. As the hours ticked by, Jaden's plan began to take shape. He would release the documents to the press. He would leak the story of Richard's affair, his threats, his lies. And once the truth was out, Richard's empire would crumble. No amount of money or influence could save him from the public's wrath, once they knew the kind of man he really was. But there was one final piece of the puzzle that Jaden needed, a face-to-face confrontation with Richard, a final meeting where Jaden could lay all the cards on the table. It was time to force Richard to make a choice, face the consequences of his actions, or continue living in the lie he had built for himself. The following morning, Jaden called Richard's office, his voice steady as he spoke to the receptionist. "I need to speak with Richard Brooks," he said. "Tell him it's Jaden. He'll know who I am." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before the receptionist replied, her tone hesitant. "Hold, please." Jaden waited, his heart pounding in his chest. The phone clicked, and then Richard's cold, calculated voice came through the line. "What do you want?" Richard asked, his tone dripping with annoyance. Jaden's grip tightened on the phone. "We need to meet. Today. This ends now." The final confrontation. The air inside Richard's office felt stifling, like the calm before a storm. Every detail of the room, the sleek, polished mahogany desk, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city below, the carefully curated pieces of modern art hanging on the walls, was designed to project power and control. For years, Richard had ruled from this room, making decisions that shaped the lives of hundreds, if not thousands, of people. But today, as he sat behind his desk, waiting for Jaden to arrive, the walls seemed to close in on him. Richard glanced at the clock, his jaw tightening. It was almost noon. Jaden would be here any minute, and Richard still hadn't decided how he would handle the situation. He had faced down corporate raiders, navigated mergers and acquisitions with ruthless precision. But this was different. This wasn't just a battle for his company or his reputation. This was about his legacy. His son. The very word sent a shiver down Richard's spine. For 24 years, he had been able to ignore Jaden's existence, to pretend that the child he had left behind didn't matter. But now, Jaden was no longer a shadow of the past. He was flesh and blood, standing at the gates of Richard's empire, demanding entry, demanding justice. Richard rubbed his temples, trying to push the growing headache to the back of his mind. He needed to stay sharp. Jaden had proven himself to be more formidable than Richard had expected. The young man was smart, determined, and had an anger that burned with the intensity of someone who had been wronged for far too long. Richard knew that this wasn't just a matter of money anymore. Jaden wanted to tear down everything Richard had built, and he had the power to do it. A soft knock at the door pulled Richard from his thoughts. His assistant, Linda, peeked in, her eyes filled with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Mr. Parker," she said quietly, "Jaden is here." Richard nodded curtly. "Send him in." Linda hesitated for a moment, her gaze flickering between Richard and the door, as if she sensed the tension in the air. But she said nothing, stepping aside to allow Jaden to enter. Jaden walked into the room with the same calm, controlled demeanor he had displayed during their first meeting. But this time, there was something different about him. There was a confidence, a quiet resolve that made Richard's stomach tighten. Jaden wasn't here to negotiate. He was here to win. "Richard," Jaden said, his voice steady as he closed the door behind him. Richard leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he studied the young man before him. "Jaden, I assume you didn't come here to exchange pleasantries." Jaden shook his head, a small, humorless smile playing at the corners of his lips. "No, I didn't." Richard motioned to the chair in front of his desk. "Sit." Jaden didn't move. He stood with his arms crossed, his gaze unwavering. "I'm not staying long. I'm just here to deliver a message." Richard raised an eyebrow, his fingers drumming lightly on the desk. "A message? And what message would that be?" Jaden reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small manila envelope. He tossed it onto the desk, the sound of it hitting the polished wood breaking the tense silence in the room. "That," Jaden said, his voice cool, "contains copies of everything I have on you. The DNA test results, the letters you wrote to my mother, her notes about the threats you made when she told you she was pregnant." Richard's heart skipped a beat as he stared at the envelope. He had known Jaden was gathering evidence, but seeing it laid out in front of him made it feel more real, more dangerous. His mind raced, calculating his next move, weighing his options. He could deny it, of course. He could claim that the documents were forgeries, that Jaden was lying. But deep down, Richard knew that the truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how much dirt you tried to bury it under. Jaden took a step closer to the desk, his eyes blazing with intensity. "I could release all of this to the press. I could destroy you with a single click." Richard's mouth went dry. He had spent years building his reputation as a visionary leader, a philanthropist, a man of integrity. But if Jaden went public with the truth, everything Richard had built would come crashing down. The affair, the threats, the abandonment of his own child. It would be a scandal that could ruin not only his business, but his personal life as well. Julia, his wife, would leave him. His board would force him out. He would lose everything. But Jaden wasn't done. "I'm not just talking about ruining your career," Jaden continued, his voice hardening. "I'm talking about prison time, Richard. There are laws against what you did, against threatening a woman into silence, against using your power to cover up the birth of a child. You think your lawyers can protect you from this? Think again." Richard clenched his jaw, his hands curling into fists beneath the desk. He had underestimated Jaden. He had thought the boy was driven by emotion, by some misguided need for validation. But now Richard saw that Jaden was more like him than he had ever realized. Cold, calculating, willing to do whatever it took to win. "So that's it?" Richard asked, his voice laced with bitterness. "You came here to blackmail me, to threaten me into giving you what you want." Jaden's smile faded, and his expression grew deadly serious. "This isn't about blackmail, Richard. This is about accountability. You've spent your entire life walking away from the consequences of your actions. You've hurt people, people like my mother, and you've never once been held responsible. Well, that ends today." Richard leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "And what do you want in return for keeping your mouth shut? Money? Power? You think I'll just write you a check and you'll disappear?" Jaden shook his head, his voice cold and resolute. "I don't want your money. I don't want anything from you. What I want is for you to face the truth. I want you to admit, publicly, what you did. I want you to tell the world how you abandoned us, how you lied to my mother, how you destroyed her life for your own selfish gain." Richard's heart pounded in his chest, a surge of panic rising as he realized just how far Jaden was willing to go. "You're asking me to destroy myself. You're asking me to throw everything away. Do you really think I'm going to do that?" Jaden met his gaze with unflinching determination. "If you don't, I will." The room fell silent, the weight of the ultimatum hanging in the air like a loaded gun. Richard could feel the walls closing in on him, the once unshakable foundation of his life crumbling beneath his feet. He had always believed that he could control every outcome, that he could manipulate the narrative to suit his needs. But now, faced with Jaden's unwavering resolve, Richard realized that this was a battle he couldn't win. He had two options: fight back and risk losing everything, or give in and hope that some small piece of his life would remain intact. Richard stood, his hands shaking as he placed them on the edge of the desk. His voice was low, laced with desperation. "There's no coming back from this, Jaden. If I go public with what I did, it's over for me. My career, my family, it's all gone." Jaden's eyes softened, just for a moment, as if he understood the weight of the decision Richard was facing. But his resolve didn't waver. "Maybe that's the price you have to pay for what you did. Maybe it's time you stopped running from the consequences." Richard closed his eyes, the room spinning around him. He had always been so certain, so sure of himself. But now, standing on the edge of ruin, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: regret. Regret for the choices he had made, for the lives he had destroyed, for the son he had abandoned. For the first time in his life, Richard was forced to confront the truth about who he really was. Not the successful businessman, not the philanthropist or the visionary leader. Just a man who had made too many wrong choices. When he opened his eyes again, he saw Jaden standing there, waiting for him to make the decision that would define the rest of their lives. With a heavy sigh, Richard sank back into his chair, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I'll do it," he said quietly. "I'll make the statement. I'll tell the truth." Jaden didn't react at first. He simply stood there, watching as the realization of Richard's words sank in. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he nodded. "I'll give you 48 hours, Jaden said, his voice devoid of triumph. "You go public, and this stays between us. But if you try to back out, if you try to cover this up, I will destroy you." Richard nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "I understand." Jaden turned to leave, his hand on the door, but before he stepped out, he paused. "You could have been a father, Richard," Jaden said quietly, without turning around. "You could have been there for us. But you chose not to. You chose to walk away. And now, you're paying the price." With that, Jaden walked out, the door closing behind him with a soft click, leaving Richard alone in the silence of his once imposing office. He sat there for a long time, staring at the envelope on his desk, the weight of his decisions pressing down on him like a crushing force. He had built his life on power, on control, on the belief that he could shape the world to his will. But in the end, it had all been a lie that was about to be exposed to the world. And as Richard stared out at the city below, he realized that no amount of wealth, no amount of influence, could save him now. 2 days later, Richard stood before the cameras, the harsh lights blinding him as he took a deep breath. The press conference had been called with little notice, and the room was filled with reporters, their cameras trained on him, waiting for the statement he had promised. His heart pounded in his chest, his palms sweaty as he gripped the edges of the podium. He could feel the weight of their gazes on him, could sense the tension in the room as they waited for him to speak. Behind him, his team stood silent, their faces expressionless as they watched their once powerful leader prepare to admit his sins. Richard had told them everything: his board, his legal team, his public relations officers. They had all advised him to stay silent, to fight, to deny the allegations. But Richard knew that this was a battle he couldn't win. Jaden had forced his hand. He glanced down at the prepared statement in front of him, the words blurring together as his mind raced. It was all there: the affair, the threats, the lies he had told to protect himself, the truth he had spent so long hiding. As the cameras flashed and the room buzzed with anticipation, Richard took one final deep breath. And then, with a voice that trembled ever so slightly, he began. "My name is Richard Brooks, and I'm here today to tell you the truth about my past." Back in his small apartment, Jaden sat in front of the television, watching as Richard's carefully constructed world came crashing down. He felt a strange sense of satisfaction, but it was tempered by something deeper, something more profound. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about truth. And now, for the first time in his life, Jaden felt free.